All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on creating your own online lab with volunteer science. My name is Jason Radford. I'm the CEO for Volunteer Science. So full disclosure, I have a financial stake in the company Volunteer Science. Our idea here is we're going to build this online lab system for people to create their own research. And the way that we're going to make that work for the next 20 years is by charging folks a small fee to access the platform and develop their own studies. So that's what Volunteer Science Inc. is for. So today I want to talk about how you actually build your online studies, why you would want to build your online studies, why you want to invest the time and energy into doing all of your behavioral work using the online lab system. So what's new? There's a couple of things that are really new with the online world that makes it worth it to try and invest your time and energy in learning how to do online experiments and developing your own online lab. The first is you can get really large sample sizes. So there's things like crowdsourcing and citizen science that have shown you can get tens of thousands of people to do one particular study. These large sample sizes help create a diversity of subjects, so you're not just stuck with a particular kind of person in your research. You're also able to solve a lot of the replicability crisis, which stems from having too few subjects. So you want to, if you're able to do online research, you can recruit more people more quickly and get larger sample sizes than you would if you were just doing it by yourself in the lab physically. Second, there are new research tools that are available to us as researchers in order to do experiments and behavioral studies in general. So first, there's new digital data. You can record people with their camera, you can get audio data, you can get their geolocation data, all by asking for it, of course. There's also social media data, like Facebook data, Twitter data, that you can integrate into your behavioral study. And then, of course, there's ubiquitous hardware, and so you have your motion sensors on your participants' mobile phones. You have their device information. There's a whole world of wearables now that you can integrate into your behavioral experiment. And so all of these things are new things that you can bring into a behavioral study to maximize the amount of research that you're able to do. So the next thing is there are new experiment types that you can do. So large-scale online experiments are now possible. If you're working in a physical lab traditionally, or in the world, the most number of people you can get into one space is maybe like 20 or 30. If you have like a class, maybe you can get it to 100. But it's really difficult to do that, and you have to do it over and over again. And when you're at a university, or even if you're at a private employer, it's really difficult to get that many groups together. There just aren't that many students in a class, or not that many psych undergrads to do a study with. So when you're doing this online, you can have as many people on a web page, doing an experiment as the server will hold, which can be thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and that allows you to do very different, very new kind of studies on huge social systems. Can this group of 100, working in a democracy, better allocate resources than this other group of 100 in a communist system, for example? Again, there are other things like wearables and nudging that you can do. So field experiments, you can actually do an experiment with people as they're doing their day-to-day life, and asking them what would you select, where would you go, what are you doing right now? You can actually take the lab out into the world. And the last thing is, there's a rush to quality in social and behavioral research right now. So people are really interested in doing studies that are replicable, which means I can do it again in my own lab with my own people. There's reproducibility, so that I can. Replication is where you take the existing study and you rerun the data and the analysis. The reproducibility is I can do it myself using my own stuff. And then other things that people want to scale. So a lot of our research has been based on people who do studies on 20 or 30 or 40 people, and the science on the small sample sizes is just not great. So there's a lot of noise, a lot of error, and if you want to sort of p-hack your way into a result, there's a lot of fungibility there. And so if you're doing an online lab, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, you can actually have research that is more easier to reproduce, easier to audit. You can actually see what things look like. And of course, as I mentioned, with the larger sample sizes, you can actually recruit more people. So with these new online experiments, you can actually get that higher quality. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there are a couple of really core problems we're trying to do online research and build your own online lab. So the first thing is, it's really hard to build. It's not really hard to build, but academics typically are not coders. People typically don't know things like JavaScript or even HTML. It's a very common language, and you use it to build websites, but that's not what we researchers do. So they can be hard to code, and therefore they can be expensive because you're hiring people or you're training your folks. That's why you're here today, to learn how to do online experiments. And so first is just that sort of cost. It's like building an online experiment. The next thing is it can be hard to recruit people. Both online and traditional methods can still yield low numbers. You've got to do a lot of work to get people to show up. You can get odd samples. If you're posting stuff on Craigslist or Twitter or Facebook, you have no idea who you're really going to get until they show up and fill out your demographic survey. You can still get expensive samples as well. So if you're recruiting workers on Mechanical Turk, even though an individual may not cost that much, if you're trying to do it at scale, it can be expensive. And it can be time-consuming. Particularly if you're doing a physical lab, you have your own participants who want to show up. You're typically paying for the entire hour's worth of their time, or the entire 30 minutes worth of their time, which can be $10 to $20 per person, plus whatever incentives you may be giving people to participate well. And so it can be really expensive and logistically time-consuming to recruit people. The last thing is that they can be hard to run. So managing subjects is logistically expensive. You've got to get people to show up. You've got to get people consented. You get their names written down. You get the email addresses written down so you can contact them later. If you're paying them, you've got to document the payments. And if you're doing a multi-person experiment, getting those people to show up at the same time only makes those problems exponentially harder. And so there's a couple of just core problems with doing online studies and even traditional studies, even real-world, offline, in the physical lab kinds of studies that are still tough nuts to crack. And I'm talking just in a second about how we try to solve those. So again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, what we're trying to do is build it once and make it accessible to everyone. Everyone who's doing online studies right now is, for the most part, creating their own thing, doing it once, and then it's not usable again. So everyone's sort of reinventing the wheel of how do you get a study built, put online, and done, and then that study's not transferable to another researcher very easily, or becomes outdated in 2 or 3 years when the new standards for JavaScript or Bootstrap or Python, Django, all this stuff go out of date. So what we're doing is we're building it once, we're keeping it updated, we're allowing it to be reverse, backwards compatible. There we go, backwards compatible. For those of you who are in the gaming world, this is being able to have a PlayStation 2 game play on the PlayStation 3, right? I guess now we're on the PS1, so it's showing my age. So we are controlling that to make sure all of that stuff works. So please, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't. It was hard enough to get volunteer science up once. Don't do it yourself. Just use our stuff. Don't go through the headache that we had to get this up and running. But that's why we created Volunteer Science. Volunteer Science is meant to be that platform that everyone can use without having to do it yourself. Don't do everything yourself. There's one takeaway from this. Don't do it yourself. Okay, so today, part one, what I'll show in this video is just sort of the introduction to the online lab. What is it, and why would you do a study in an online lab? Why would you create an online lab with many studies, many participants? And then after that, we'll talk about recruiting subjects, and then in the afternoon, we're going to talk about some basics of coding, and we'll do a little hackathon around helping you build your own study. Right, so I'm going to talk about these 3 hard problems and how we solve them. So just a reminder, it's hard to build an online study, it's hard to recruit for an online study, and it's hard to run an online study. Or it's hard to run any studies. So here's how we solve that problem. The hard to build problem, hard to code. Solution is we make coding easy. So in some cases we can say we can eliminate coding altogether. When you should eliminate coding just because it saves you a lot of time. You don't have to read the code. Anybody, even a computer science major is going to tell you that it's hard to pick up code and just read it, understand it. So we want to eliminate coding as much as possible. And the way that we do that is we create these templates. So we have a prisoner's dilemma template, a reaction time template, traveling salesperson template. When I say reaction time, I mean like for those psychologists in the room, a Stroop experiment or a flanker experiment or an implicit association task. All of these are templates on our website. And that allows you to, just clone the experiment, set a couple of variables in the graphic user interface. You don't have to see the code at all, and you can deploy the version that you want. So the first step is no coding whatsoever with these templates. The second thing is we use common languages. This is not from easy to more difficult. This is just a theoretical approach here. So the second thing is common languages. We're only using HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Theoretically, you can also use Flash if you wanted to. As long as it gets rendered in the browser, you can do it. But all of our stuff is really written in JavaScript and HTML. And the reason we do that is because, one, there's a ton of documentation, a ton of libraries for these languages. You can hire any computer science undergrad, basically any kind of freshman, first year student, second year student, and they probably already know this stuff because it's so common. So if you have any questions, if you want to know how to do something, it's all there for you. And if you learn it on volunteer science, you can reuse it to build your own websites, to build future web apps. It's a very extensible system, and so if you want to take the time to invest in this stuff, it's a high return. You're not learning something special like, for those of you who are statisticians, it's not like Stata or SAS where you have to learn a very specific kind of programming lingo to get a specific thing working that can be really hard to read later. This is all common stuff. Another thing is an easy API. So what we do is we create these very complicated things, and then we allow researchers or users on volunteer science to call that thing with just sort of 1 or 2 lines of code. So we have a Facebook data donation app where you can collect people's Facebook data, and as a researcher, all you have to do is type in one function call, and I think it's get Facebook data or something. It's like get Facebook data, and then in the parentheses you say posts or images, whatever the Facebook endpoint is, and then you're done. When the game launches, they press a button, they see the Facebook request that says, hey, this person wants your images. You say yes, and then ta-da, you have them in your experiment. So that's what we mean by easy API. We built it for you already. You can just call it in one, with one, not always one, but a small set of lines. And still written in JavaScript, so again, it's very easy to read if you know what JavaScript looks like. Same thing we have for group chat, for creating networks, for consenting subjects. All of these things are complex things that we can do with one function call. The next thing is easy integration. And I'll talk about this a lot in the second half of this particular presentation. But what volunteer science does is it allows you to integrate different kinds of services into one another. So like stitching it all together so you can go from Qualtrics to Mechanical Turk or SurveyMonkey to Mechanical Turk. You can integrate your RedCap survey with volunteer science, all of that stuff. So the idea is, there are some things that volunteer science is really good at, and there are some things that we're okay at, and sometimes you really need something that's perfect, or something that's really excellent. And so, we allow you to build up the core stuff that you want in volunteer science, and when you actually really need those subjects on Mechanical Turk, or when you need a really high quality survey, you can go to Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, and they'll work with whatever study you've already built. So if you want to do a Qualtrics, so for example, right, I have a Qualtrics survey where I have people reading a vignette, and then I want them to talk in a group about who they decide to hire based on the vignette. And so I have the Qualtrics survey, and then in volunteer science, I use those 16. In volunteer science, I can create a chat room in 16 lines of code, which is on our templates page. Go from Qualtrics to volunteer science in 30 minutes. I can create that experiment from scratch in 30 minutes. This is what I mean by integration and using the strengths of volunteer science, but then leveling up to Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Mechanical Turk or these other specific systems when you need to. And lastly, there's this maximum reuse here. So you build it once and you can just reuse it as many times as you want. And this is one of the big reasons why you would choose volunteer science in an online lab in general over doing it physically in person. You build the code once, and then you can just iterate on it just a little bit every time. So I have one experiment right now where we are doing a two-person bargaining experiment, and this is the very first time we've ever created an experiment with this particular setup, and so there's a whole bunch of questions we can answer, or at least ask with this particular experiment. And so we're doing one now, but we've got another 6 experiments that are lined up as soon as this one's over to answer different variations of this question about understanding how people choose to go to war. Essentially, is the story there. And now that we have the one version up, the sort of the core experience game, like creating the 6 new versions is only going to take another 5 or 10 minutes, really, of like just tweaking some small things to make the whole thing different. So maximum reuse here. So how do we solve the recruiting problem? And now, as I said, there's a whole presentation that I'm going to go into on like recruiting. But what you want to do, at a very high level, is recruit first. You want to have access to as many diverse pools as possible. So you want to have your physical lab, you have your mechanical Turk workers, you have your volunteers, because every study is different. Some studies you have to pay people. You've got to, you need to actually give people $5 if you tell them that like their decision is going to, make them $5. Sometimes you don't have the funding to pay people, and so you need to find volunteers. And so that's what volunteer science is about on the recruiting side. It's giving you access to all of the subject pools that you should have access to, as opposed to doing your work on Mechanical Turk and then trying to figure out how to get people to show up in a lab, and then figuring out like how to create a website so you can get volunteers. All of this stuff is in one place on volunteer science. And so that's the way that we approach recruiting subjects. And you can, and I mentioned, we have a subject management system where if people take your studies, you ask them to give them your email address, or give you their email address, and then you can email them later. And so as you do more and more studies on volunteer science, you build up a larger and larger pool of your own. And I'll talk about this in a little bit later, but you can keep track of people's demographic data and do whatever surveys that you want, and keep reusing that data over and over again, with people's consent, of course, and build up your own sort of pool or panel of subjects that you can just keep going back to. And the good thing about this too, about this sort of custom pool of yours, is that people then know you, they know your research, and so they're much more willing to come back and do a new study, or ask their friends to do a study for you. So definitely build out your own pool if you can, because it's very powerful. The last thing is, it's hard to actually run these studies. It's expensive to actually get people to show up, and then it's much worse to get them, or it's much more difficult to get them to show up together on time. So the solution here is we automate a lot of this stuff away. So if you're doing multi-person studies, something that people almost never think about until the very end is like, how do you actually get 5 people to go from sitting on a website to in the same experiment together? And that's what a waiting room does, and that's what the waiting room is in volunteer science offers. It's just one of those things that you never think about until you're actually there. I've seen a lot of people build a multi-person study and then be like, wait a second, how are we actually getting a bunch of people to do the same thing at once? So all of that stuff is automated on volunteer science. Same thing with the consent. Like, how do you want to get people to sign consents? There's a consent management system where you just upload the consent document and then click a box, and then you have it. Same thing with player screening and randomization. You can set up a screening criteria so that when they fill out the demographic survey, at one point you can say, people who have this particular characteristic can or can't see this study, and so they don't know that the right people know that it's there. And you can also control matching. Like, if you want a diverse group and you have people who filled out that they're white, and some people who filled out that they're black, and some people who filled out that they're Asian, you can make sure that you've diversified your groups in that particular experiment using this kind of screening process. And lastly, there's data filtering. So you do your study. You did some of it on Mechanical Turk. You did some with volunteers. You did some with your lab. It's very easy to filter out or filter your data based on the method of recruitment. So the way that we do this with volunteer science is we just automate a lot of this management process. So let me just show you what volunteer science actually is. So there's the lab management side where you're actually seeing all of the team members that you have in your lab. You can see all the experiments. If this is just a screenshot here, but if you were actually like on this page, the experiments page will show you like how many experiments or how many people have taken your experiments in the last 24 hours or week. So it's a calendar system, so you can just look. You can customize the interface there. You can create a new experiment, add more team members. You can manage the whole the whole lab from volunteer science. And every experiment has its own sort of study management page where you can see the code of the experiment if you want to. You can change the variables for the experiment. And this is how we make it easy for you to just clone an experiment, change a little bit of the variable as opposed to writing new code and getting a new version out. Then you can see the consent and achievements. So these are, again, these are things that you can upload and just integrate into an existing study as opposed to trying to build it yourself. Subject feedback is where you can see people's questions that they have, the questions that people had about your study or comments. And I'll say most people are use the subject feedback to say thank you, or it's like this was really interesting, or this is great, or just share their thoughts. It's not we don't see a lot of people complaining. People tend to like our stuff, so don't be afraid of feedback. You don't see a lot of people trolling here. There's a data export, so the experiment, you can just export all of your data from right there. And then user subscriptions is where you actually see the place where people have signed up for your email list. But actually, I will show you. This is where it all goes. So once they sign up, and you can also upload your own contact list. Once they sign up, you can you'll have this interface here where you can create email messages and then text messages. The phone call panel is still in process as well as the push notifications, but at least the push notifications is almost done. So you'll be able to actually send these people messages, and you'll actually see their contact information. And there's a place where you can give them attributes, so you can say like, I know this person is white, or I know this person is black, or I know this person is under 21, those kinds of things. Assign them attributes, and then you can send them messages. So, I want to message everybody in my contact list who is in the Boston area, so they can actually show up physically to the lab to participate. So that's the subject management system in volunteer science. So the way it all works together is you build your team, you create your experiments, and when you have your experiments, you can put them up on Volunteer Science on the website, and then email your subjects, or just leave it up and let volunteers do it, or do mechanical Turk workers. That's the very big picture of what an online lab is for volunteer science. So, as I said, you create your experiment on Volunteer Science, you post it to your lab webpage, or you can post it to our homepage. Then you recruit from whatever pool you need, mechanical Turk, physically in person, in the classroom, online volunteers, using your own social media if you wanted to. And then once you've done the study, you download your data. And there's a manual process where you can point and click your way through, or you can do it automatically if you're more comfortable with pulling from a URL and getting JSON or XML data. So, the second half. Why would you create an online lab? I talked about some of these new things that are happening in the world of social experiments, and why an online lab would take advantage of those things. But I really want to go into what it is about the online lab that makes it worth your time and energy. So the first is that it produces valid science. And I'll talk about what that, I'll go into all of these in a second, but the first thing is that it's a valid way of doing research. There's a lot of research in the past 15, 20 years, depending on which technology is being validated, but it's all showing that you can do most science online, and it's fine. Like, you're going to produce valid results that replicate anything you would do in the physical lab. It's not always true, but it's generally true. Second, it produces quality science. The stuff that you're able to do in an online lab is much better. I don't say much better. I'm not going to denigrate physical lab research because it's not actually that much worse, and in a lot of cases better. But it produces really good science, and I'll argue why in a second. And secondly, or finally, it enhances the physical lab. So a lot of people still have physical labs, or need people to show up physically. This is not a replacement for a physical lab. It sort of could be, but if you have a physical lab, it will actually make your physical lab a lot more effective, a lot more efficient, and give it a lot more flexibility and resources than you would have otherwise. So let me talk about the valid science piece. So first off, something that's very new in the last 10 years is getting subjects online from these crowd working platforms. Now, I'll say for those of you who've been around for a long time, people have been doing online research with online subjects for a long time, a lot longer than the last 10 years. Probably since the mid 80s, maybe early 90s. People have been recruiting folks online. So this goes back a long time, but most recently we've had this wave of validations of trying to get, trying to determine whether participants in Mechanical Turk, which is the Amazon one here, Crowdflower and Prolific actually produce good science, and they all show that yes, these are all people who are participating well. Not everybody participates well, but in general, when you recruit people from these pools, the results replicate your standard results from as if you were running it in a physical lab, and more importantly, these pools are much more diverse. So Mechanical Turk has internationalized most recently, but in some of the earlier replications, when Mechanical Turk was still mostly U.S. based, it was a much broader sample of the population, more diverse in terms of age and education. So these not only are these platforms more producing valid research, but they're also producing higher quality research. Next, computer-based instruments. Now the validation here has been going back for almost 30 years. Since the computer was something that you could actually put on somebody's table. That's 30, 40 years. We've been doing this research on can you elicit basic cognitive, social, and economic effects just through a computer interface, as opposed to having people interact with one another in person. And of course, all of this stuff is valid. With Qualtrics doing surveys, the experimental economics, OTRI. This is OTRI. All of these platforms have shown to produce valid research in the same way as if you were doing it in a lab with paper and pencil. And actually, in a lot of ways, it's a lot better, particularly in psychology, where it's more important to control the timing of things and getting a higher precision estimate of time. These technical systems are better. And lastly, this is sort of where volunteer science sort of fits in, but these internet-based instruments, and making sure that when you're doing subjects online with computer-based systems, if you're doing it on the internet, you have these sort of weird things that can happen around lag or latency, sending out information to people, making sure that they're paying attention, not even if they're working, but just volunteers doing something for you. And all of these have been shown to be validated. So you can do research with volunteers online. And I'll actually talk about how volunteer science does this right now, but my battery is dying, so give me a second to plug in. Okay. All right. Cool. Turn the brightness up there. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So this is what we do with volunteer science to validate that you can do this kind of stuff with our platform. So this is a published paper back in 2016. Yeah, 2016. And what we did was we wanted to try and replicate a variety of behavioral interventions and behavioral studies, social behaviors from a number of different disciplines to show that no matter what discipline you're in, computer science, economics, psychology, sociology, you can do research on volunteer science, and the kinds of behaviors that you want to elicit from people can be elicited using volunteer science. And so, in cognitive psychology, we replicated the Stroop and Flanker test. The social psychology, we replicated the Big Five, all of these are attempts to replicate. We'll see in a second that they do replicate. Economics, we're looking at the prisoner's dilemma, the commons dilemma, and the public goods game. All of these are very standard kinds of research paradigms that people would want to use in different disciplines. We've got some behavioral economics, group behavior, social psychology. And what we did was, we built these studies on volunteer science, and we just put them up. and we recruited people on social media, by email, your typical like crowd work, or not crowd work, citizen science, crowd science kind of method of recruitment. And what we show is, yes, we can replicate almost everything except for the social psychology stuff. And when I say social psychology, this is the sociological version of social psychology, not the psychological version of social psychology, which is to say, then the ones that we don't replicate well involve influence of people in a room together. So we weren't able to simulate that stuff. And I will say that some of the stuff is the effects are small, and so it's very difficult to try and elicit them anywhere. But yes, in general, if you're doing behavioral research, behavioral economics, social psychology, cognitive psychology, game theory, group behavior, like all of this stuff can be done on volunteer science with volunteers and with partners too. Okay, so lesson number 1: the online lab is a valid mode of research. You can build stuff on volunteer science, put it out to people, whether it's the crowd, whether it's mechanical Turk workers, whether it's students in your lab, and get valid results. The next piece, you can actually do high quality science. Like not only can you do good science, but you can do great science on volunteer science. So the first thing is it's replicable, and I'll talk about each of these. I'll go into each one of these, but you can do much better research in the reproducibility, accountability metric. So if you want it to be reproducible, it's better to go online. So it's high fidelity. You can audit the process. Second is scalable. Again, going back to you can recruit many subjects and you can get really large group studies. So you can actually do things that you just can't do in the lab. And lastly, you can access a whole global pool of participants. We're not just sort of stuck with Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic participants, the so-called weirdos, that has become the famous acronym for what's really like sophomores in a lab. So, on the reproducibility side, the old and busted version of this is if you wanted to reproduce or replicate something, you would try to read the paper, figure out what they did, pray that they put their survey methods, like the survey that they use, like in the appendix, or at least they mentioned the instructions somewhere. A lot of times they didn't, like the actual text, and so you would have to just try to write it yourself and pray that you got the most important things right, and then you'd run with your students in your lab, and maybe it would replicate, maybe it wouldn't, but then you wouldn't publish it because nobody in the journal world would accept it because it's a reproducible or it's a replication study, and replication studies don't really get published, and then you don't get tenure, so you never replicate anything anyway. Why would you do it? It makes no sense. Today, you can get tenure, and I'll show you how. First, with volunteer science, you can share your code. So if you create a study in volunteer science, anybody anywhere else in the world can clone that particular piece of code, run it on their own subjects, and have the exact same kind of experience that your subjects get. So you're reproducing the study exactly. You don't have to worry about whether somebody published their survey instrument because you actually have the entire code. So you can reproduce the study exactly, and because you can have this stuff, it's just one button to get a copy of the code. You can do it quickly. And then if you have your own physical lab, you have your own volunteers, you have people ready to go, you can run a replication in 24 hours. If you gave me your study on volunteer science, I could replicate it in 24 hours. No problem. So you run your replication, you see whether it works. Does it replicate, does it not? In today's world, you can publish it in an open science journal, which, of course, on its own will not get you tenure, but you can publish. And you can ask folks like Brian Nozick. Yes, you can get tenure on based on replications and trying to understand what makes for good science. So today you can get tenure. You just have to use volunteer science. So that's my speech. So scale. The way that you would do this before the online lab is that you would have one study and you would run it in the lab for years on end. So you would actually have you would do like 3 or 4 generations of psych undergrads. In your experiment, and you would just run it and run it and run it until you had that many people. That's one way to get a ton of people. Just run it for a couple of years in your psych lab. Another way of doing it is calling thousands of people. So people who are doing like national surveys, you just call people up and hope they say, yes, I have 20 minutes, and you would do the survey or study with them right there. The other thing is you post ads on buses and trains and newspapers, which is still really common right now if you're not doing students. You put an ad in a bus or your public transit system or your newspaper, and you hope people respond and show up. It's a super expensive way of doing things, but sometimes that's the only thing you do. Or alternatively, like post flyers around campus or around some space where you want to collect participants. And lastly, you can collaborate with dozens of faculty, and I'll sort of hint at this a little bit later because it's also how you do global experiments. But you would find a bunch of your friends in the research world, and you would say, "Hey, I've got this study. I need 1,000 people, and I can only get 200 in my lab. Can I get another 100 from your lab? Are you willing to run your students through my study, or run my study with your students?" And at the end of the day, like you're going to be getting groups of less than 10, maybe, for any version of this. So you're not. I mean, you can get 1,000 or 5,000 people to participate, but it's many small groups at a time. So if you wanted to do a group or a study of 100 people, in a traditional lab setting, that can be really difficult. There's a couple of labs that have like big auditoriums and can get people to show up at that kind of scale, but it's very, very rare to have that capacity. But with an online lab, you can. So volunteer science, we have an email list of 40,000 volunteers. I can email people tomorrow and have about 1,000 people participate in a study. Or the Mechanical Turk, there are 10,000, it's probably more now, that's kind of an old number, but there are 10,000 active Turkers working in a given day on Mechanical Turk, or maybe it's at a given time even. But Mechanical Turk is a huge pool. If you want 10,000 people, you can get 10,000 Turkers. You can, again, you're paying them, but you can do it. And you can do it in a week. 10,000 people in a week is not that hard on Mechanical Turk if you have the funding for it, if you have the funding to pay them. For Facebook ads. So we've done this. Facebook, 3 billion people use Facebook on a given day. If you're using Facebook ads, theoretically you can reach all 3 billion of them, which no one is actually going to do. But if you wanted to recruit women under 35 in Afghanistan, among the 3 billion, I can guarantee you there's probably about 10 to 20 million of women in Afghanistan under the age of 30 who look at Facebook on a given day, maybe a week. So it's a huge place to post ads. Compare that to like your bus station or a newspaper in which you may have a circulation of tens of thousands of people. So, and on volunteer science, what we've seen here is in the last 5 years, we've been able to run 500,000 experimental sessions with folks. We're almost at 500,000. It's like 490 something. So we're rounding up. We're going to celebrate when we get to 500,000. But yeah, I mean, 500,000 sessions in 5 years is an enormous amount of research getting done. And lastly, with this capacity, you can reach groups of 10,000 or more. I'm not going to promise that we can get a group of 10,000, but it's not unheard of and not impossible. Which, if you're doing this with the physical lab, totally impossible. Okay, the last thing, old and busted recruitment, you're doing sophomores in a lab, and these, because most research getting published is at universities in the U.S., Canada, North America, and Europe, you're focusing on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic participants, which may give you different economic behaviors, different social psychological profiles, different problem-solving strategies. And there's actually a lot of research on what does and doesn't replicate from the sophomores in a lab to a general population. So it actually differs a lot based on the question. But today, the Mechanical Turk diversity is the new standard. So you can, if you post something to Mechanical Turk and you say it has to be people in the United States, you're going to get a really diverse sample. It's going to be by age, by education, by income, by religious beliefs. You have a lot more demographic variety than you would in your undergrad subject pool. It's certainly not perfect. It's not representative. There's still kinds of people that are relatively infrequent to reach on Mechanical Turk, like conservatives. Conservatives are relatively infrequent on Mechanical Turk, so it can be challenging to do political science research on Mechanical Turk, but it's still possible. And it's still much better than doing an undergrad pool. So I want to do a plug for the Psychological Sciences Accelerator, which is a global network of research labs. It's mostly in psychology, but they do a lot of studies that are not just psychology. It comes out of psychology, which is why it's called Psychological Sciences. But with their lab, I think you can run 100 labs in about 3 to 6 months, depending on the consent process. And with volunteer science, you can run the same study, all of those labs, without any kind of variation, unless you need to do some translations. The next thing is Facebook ads. In our experience, we've been able to run, and I'll talk in the next section about how you do this. But with what we've been able to do, we did a global Facebook ad appeal, and in I think a week or week and a half, we got 30,000 people from 100 countries to fill out a demographic survey and 2 personality surveys for free. These are all volunteers. We didn't pay anybody. This is just, hey, here's a Facebook ad for doing something nice for social science, and 30,000 people in 100 countries in a week. And then actually the cost per completion was around 30 cents, 30 to 50 cents per completion. And again, I'll talk later about how we get that cost low. And there's a lot of wrong ways to do that. I've met a lot of people who've blown a bunch of money on Facebook ads and Google ads. So don't just turn around tomorrow and try to do a bunch of Facebook ads because you will lose your shirt. There's a right way and a wrong way. If you're interested, stick around for the next one. The last thing is, for us, for volunteer science, that 44,000 volunteers are from 126 countries. We have a really diverse pool of people just among our volunteers. It's difficult to target them. We don't have a lot of any one particular population. So we, maybe we don't have 20 million women under 30 in Afghanistan, but you can actually get 1 or 2, which you wouldn't be able to do before. Yes. Yes. Do you want coffee?
Yeah, I won't get coffee.
Oh yeah, no worries. I'm just doing a recording of the presentation.
Nice. Sorry for interruption.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. So let's see. Okay. So the take-home lesson here is that the online lab is a robust model of research. Not only are you doing valid science, but you're able to do science that's on average much better than traditional lab-based science on a number of really important dimensions. So the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the combination of the online lab and the offline lab. Together, it's an amazing combination. So first, the online lab allows the people in an offline lab or a traditional physical lab to collect a whole bunch of new kinds of data with their traditional, in addition to their traditional lab studies or lab facilities. So you can get social media data, chat logs amongst users, video and audio data from folks. You can combine your lab experiment with a field experiment. You can also do capture.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So are we still have the tutorial here?
Yeah. What time is it? Is it? Yeah, there we go. Okay. The lunch is at 12. Is that right?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm almost. Yes, I think I have 4 slides left. So with the online lab, you can, integrating it with the physical lab, you can collect data from folks' browsers and their devices, like search histories or cookies, their SMS messages, their images from their camera, and their locations from Google. Of course, all of this stuff with people's permissions. You can introduce new forms of experimental control. Like one of the things that's really difficult to do in a physical lab is build control systems that limits who can talk to who. So in the online lab, all you have to do is code up a chat room for determining player A can talk to player B and player B can talk to player C, but A can't talk to C, and that's really easy to code. More difficult to try and enforce in a physical lab. And if you want to do something more complex than that, it's even harder. But it's easy to do in the online lab. You can simulate interfaces. So if you want to see how people would navigate Facebook or Twitter, you can do that with volunteer science by editing the code that Facebook and Twitter sends you and giving them like a simulated interface, and to see would people click on fake news or would people click on something that's more personalized versus something that's more neutral. You can also create bots. So if you wanted to have people interact with a chat bot around a particular topic, you can do that. If you want to do so, one of the things that's really common in a physical lab is having a compatriot. So you have somebody who's there to sort of in on what the experiment's about to try and get people to do something. And you can do that in the online lab with bots, which gives you a lot more control, especially if you're trying to create something that's reproducible. It's difficult to get a compatriot to do the same thing every time, and if you want some other lab to do that same thing, it can be difficult for that lab to figure out how to get the compatriots right. Yes, you can also do social media apps and interventions, so you can send users tweets or direct messages. You can grab friends' pictures from Facebook. Because you can get the people's friends list, you can still get some of that data. Not that you're trying to save it, but you can actually see would you is your mom a better friend than your random friend from college or whatever. And lastly, you can get this fine-grained timing control. I talked a little bit about that and how important it is to psychology, but you can do the same thing with collective decision making and making sure that people take 30 minutes or 30 seconds to make a decision, those kinds of things. And lastly, you can track or manage data a little bit more efficiently. So you can track users across studies. You're able to see this person participated in one experiment and now they're back for another one, and you can align that data. You can track payments and performance, so you know who scored what, as opposed to hoping that people write this stuff down correctly. You can recontact participants, so you get their contact information first, put them in the volunteer science subject management system, and then send them an email later. You can, reuse data from other studies. This is one of the big things for volunteer science, is that you can collect demographic data that's attached to that user for the rest of their time, unless they delete their account or request data deletion, which is totally doable. And then just instead of having them do the demographic survey every time they want to do a study, you just reuse it. Same thing for a Big Five survey or a behavior or a prisoner's dilemma. If there's just sort of a standard set of data that you want on all of your participants, you can create that. And lastly, there's the consent recording. So this is a digital signature that people can carry around with them, in an abstract way. So the way this sort of fits in is that there are 30 different pieces of software that you can use to do online experiments or online lab work. And the way that volunteer science fits in is, we can do almost all of this stuff. We can't do all of this stuff. But if you want to do something that's specialized or requires something that is unavailable, you can just add it to volunteer science. So it integrates with MailChimp or it integrates with Z-Tree. If you need some very specific functionality, but otherwise the online lab can sort of cover you for all of these different use cases. And it all integrates into one space, as opposed to trying to align your Qualtrics data with your ePrime data, or your ePrime data with your Mechanical Turk data. Keep it all in one place. So the online lab sort of expands the horizon of what's possible for social and behavioral research. So in the afternoon, we're going to give you everything that you need to get started with volunteer science. We'll give you an account, we'll show you how to create experiments, and then we'll sort of do some hacking work around any experiments or stuff that you want to create. And after the break, we'll talk about sort of recruiting subjects, because the whole art to recruiting subjects, there's 20 ways to do it, there's 15 ways to do it right, 5 ways to do it wrong. So we'll go through that. Anyway, thank you so much. Enjoy the coffee and ask me anything.